The Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom in Japan, is one of the most influential and beloved video game consoles of all time. It brought video gaming out of the 1983 crash, and some of the greatest franchises including Super Mario, Metroid, Castlevania, Final Fantasy, Mega Man, and The Legend of Zelda began on the NES. Today, cartridges hold their value, and there are plenty of independent titles presented in 8-bit form, as a love letter to the system, including Shovel Knight and Castle in the Darkness to name a couple. Nintendo already capitalized on the gamer's nostalgia, creating the Virtual Console service for the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS. But on July 2016, Nintendo took it a step further by announcing a dedicated console based on the NES, with 30 pre-installed titles presented in sharp pixelated HD. Sounds very tempting, and there was a lot of excitement towards the gaming community. Then it would be killed off minutes, possibly seconds after pre-orders were available, crashing websites and selling out instantly. And why wouldn't it? At the time, this system was too good to be true. Some of the best games of the third generation in one collection. Unfortunately, combined with low supply, it also became the product for scalpers, forcing you to pay multiple times more than its retail price if you wanted one. And to add insult to injury, the system was discontinued half a year later. There were rumors that Nintendo were trying to create artificial scarcity to give the impression that it was in high demand, just like the Amiibo figures. However, Nintendo of America president Reggie Fils-Aimé insists that the company didn't anticipate nor have enough resources to meet with the demand, and were more focused on the release of the Switch. I can understand the latter because it's Nintendo's newest console, and they want to make a statement after the commercial disappointment of the Wii U, but they might as well have announced the NES Mini after the Switch release. They missed out on the opportunity to sell so much more by 2018. This slow supply, high demand story kind of brings back the days of the NES itself, when Nintendo had a shortage of lock chips to give out to publishers, and they were just as frustrated with the company as we were with the shortage of NES Minis. Deja vu, anyone? But on September 2017, after the Super Nintendo Mini was released, and continued to quote incredible demand, not only would the Super Nintendo Mini continue production into 2018, but they would re-release the NES Mini sometime in the middle of that year. And I pre-ordered it almost immediately after a release date was announced, because I didn't want to risk missing out again. After 2 years of waiting, I finally had my own NES Classic Edition. Was it worth waiting this long? Well, no. Nintendo should have understood the commercial potential early and made enough systems to begin with. The real question is, just how good is this dedicated console? Because I've already reviewed the Super Nintendo Mini, don't be surprised if I make comparisons. Firstly, the box art looks amazing. I remember picking it up with huge excitement, the list of games on the back. I've never reviewed an NES game before, and how many years it's taken to get one. The Super Nintendo box looks more vibrant, but both replicate boxes of their original counterparts. Out of the box, you get a HDMI cable, micro USB, a replica NES controller, and of course, the system itself. This time I'm not surprised by its size because I'm familiar with the Super Nintendo Mini. Although the cartridge slot doesn't exist, the buttons still have a purpose. However, because they're tiny and right next to each other, it's very easy to accidentally press power instead of reset. This takes you to the main menu, so unless you're playing an RPG, you'll be pressing it often. Obviously, it's not the console's fault. That's what the original NES looked like. When you shrink it, the buttons are closer to each other, and if the buttons were placed differently, people would complain even more about that. It's only a minor nitpick. Like the Super Nintendo Mini, you must buy your own AC adapter. The back of the box illustrates the specifications, 5 volts, 1 amp, and if you want to play it safe, I recommend the official Nintendo one. These are easy to find, but again, why they couldn't just give you one like any other gaming console I've bought, I'll never comprehend. The controller is a replica of the original, including the button layout, shape, size, etc. It's an NES controller, apart from the outlet, which can also be used to plug into a Wiimote so you can play virtual console games with this controller. Unfortunately, it only comes with one, and I've heard that separate controllers are even harder to find than the system itself. Fortunately, the Super Nintendo Mini, which came bundled with 2 controllers, are compatible as well, and another way to experience co-op multiplayer, something Nintendo excels in. Also, the cable length is longer, which is something I have to bring up. 30 inches, or 76 centimeters. Seriously, Nintendo? Is this to save resources so you can create a higher quantity of these? That's honestly the only logical explanation I can come up with. That, and because you're going to be close to the system anyway to quickly access the menu screen. Still, this is the 2018 re-release we're looking at. Cables are just as short, yet the Super Nintendo mini controller cables are longer. Now I don't have a Wii Classic controller to compare, but I've read that the cable is nearly 5 inches or 13 centimeters longer than the NES mini replica, but that was designed to be plugged into a Wiimote to avoid excess wiring, whereas the shorter cabled NES controller was designed to be plugged into a console. What kind of logic is that? If it had an optional inlet for a center bar and you can select the games in the menu with the Wiimote, then it would be fine. But instead, you get a combined cable length of around 90 inches from the television. It's a relief that the original NES didn't have hardwired controllers just like the Japanese Famicom Mini. How can Nintendo not fix this issue given how much time it's taken for it to be re-released? Because if they did, not only would it make the system more practical than it deserves, but it can also help identify the difference between a real NES and a bootleg one, whether it's longer cables or an extra controller. This is the only serious flaw with the system, but you don't realize how much of a nuisance it is until you play it. We really take wireless controllers for granted these days. I'm glad to get that off my chest, because everything else about the system is excellent. Video output is 720p and 60 frames per second, and you have the option to change the display from standard 4x3 to a CRT filter for that old RF signal look, and pixel perfect. It has the same glitches too, including mistranslations and entering the unknown, which makes the CRT filter look more authentic than the Super Nintendo Mini. Combine this with the replica controller, it feels right at home on a HD TV, and a trip down memory lane for gamers who grew up with the original NES. The system has 30 pre-installed games to choose from. Most of them are genuine masterworks of that era, and are still fun to play, including the Super Mario Bros. Trilogy, Metroid, The Legend of Zelda, Punch-Out!, and third-party titles including Castlevania, Double Dragon 2, Super Contra, Mega Man 2, and Final Fantasy. Also, 8 of the games are exclusive based on region. The PAL and North American version, for example, comes with Castlevania 2, Bubble Bobble, and Tecmo Bowl, whereas the Japanese Famicom Mini has NES Open Golf, Final Fantasy 3, not the Super Nintendo version, and River City Ransom. In the PAL region, you'll get the North American version of these games. Super Contra, for example, is Probotector 2 Return of Evil Forces in Europe and Australia, but on the NES Mini, it's Super Contra, which is what I call it anyway. There's a highly diverse level of genres here, including platformers, RPGs, beat-em-ups, arcade ports, fighting, racing, side-scrolling shooter, vertical shooter, and the thick skin. Now I can understand why games like DuckTales and Tetris aren't on here, but there are a few surprising omissions, including Bionic Commando, Blaster Master, and the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, which isn't even on the Famicom Mini. And apart from Mario, Castlevania, and Zelda, there's only one title from each franchise. For the most part, they pick the right games, and you can never have the perfect lineup. As previously mentioned, the reset button takes you back to the main menu screen. Your progress will be automatically saved from where you left off, and you have the option to keep it and come back to it later. You may think it's a cheaper way to beat games like Ghosts and Goblins, Ninja Gaiden, and Castlevania. Yeah, you can save it near points that frustrate you the most, but you have to understand that battery saves were a new thing in video games back in the mid to late 80s. The Legend of Zelda is considered the first ever video game to include a save feature. Metroid, a non-linear adventure platformer, only allows passwords along with Punch-Out!, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, and Super Mario Bros. 3 has no save or password feature at all. Point being, there are plenty of games where saving your progress is necessary, but most developers didn't have the technology to implement it back then, and that's why I'm perfectly okay with save states on the NES Mini. Add to that, the menu music is 8-bit. If you leave it for a minute, Mario and Luigi take turns to change the background color, while the icon morphs into a main character of a game in this collection. And if you scan the QR code here with your phone, you'll get access to manuals of all the games, though you can use the internet as well. There's so much of that Nintendo personality injected here that even the menu is almost another game in itself. It's hard not to repeat myself because the Super Nintendo Mini is the exact same system, except with 21 SNES games and a rewind system. It would have made more sense to have both of these in the same video when I reviewed the SNES Mini in 2017, but I couldn't because NES Minis were borderline impossible to find during its initial run. So make your mind up fast if you're interested in one of these, and find a lengthier HDMI cable. But at least I can finally review the Super Mario and Zelda franchises, starting with where it all began. Like the SNES Mini, if you're interested in Nintendo's past and unwilling to invest the money to experience it because NES products are expensive and aren't designed for HD TVs in mind, the NES Classic Edition is a great alternative. How much more can you ask for? Oh yeah, more units. Hopefully this year it'll be the case, because this is worth it just for the Nintendo published games alone. A huge recommendation if you can get your hands on one.